Hey friends, I am here to do a little reading from the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This book is maybe one part history, one part philosophy, and one part memoirs from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the writer, who actually won the Nobel Prize for this book. It's part of our good books list, and it's one of the starred books that I recommended to be starred because I think everybody should read this book. Maybe not everybody, but everybody who's at least in high school or college. I didn't read it till after I left college. My first exposure to it was as an idea. My brother was reading One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich when I was in grade school, and I read part of that book and thought it was very grim, so I didn't want to read this until after I got out of college, and I discovered that it was really a fascinating story. Solzhenitsyn himself considered it journalism, and this book was released in 1973. One of the things about it that makes it even more interesting is the KGB had tried to assassinate Solzhenitsyn, in part because of this book. They knew he was writing it, or they suspected that. He had to write this from, it was about a 9-year period, 10-year period, where he was hiding at people's houses and doing his work surreptitiously. And when it came out, he had about 6 weeks of living in the Soviet Union before he went into exile, afraid for his life, apparently. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for it, and then couldn't go back and collect it because the people who were doing the ceremony were afraid of the Soviet Union. So, why am I suggesting that you read this book, even though it's ostensibly, I mean, it's recounting the stories, the true stories of people who lived in the Soviet gulags during the Cold War, before and during the Cold War, and I think it's important to read because he does such a fascinating exploration of the nature of good and evil, of human nature, really. And the thing that he does that's a little different is he says, yes, Stalin was evil. Yes, he killed like 60 million people, according to Solzhenitsyn. But it's not just the evil in the other guy that's the problem. It's the evil that's in all of us. And he does a great job of just extrapolating that out and examining it from lots of different angles. And so the book is really just a collection of different things, from facts and vignettes, little anecdotes that he's heard from other people. I think I mentioned this 256 prisoners that he interviewed. The original version was 2,100 pages long in 3 volumes. This is the much shorter abridged version, one of several abridgments. So this is on our good books list. I suggest you read it, but I'm going to give you a taste of it by reading some excerpts from the book. I'm going to read at least 4. I might read a 5th one. We'll see. I'm going to start with one of those anecdotes that I mentioned earlier. Here is one vignette from those years as it actually occurred. A district party conference was underway in Moscow province. It was presided over by a new secretary of the district party committee, replacing one recently arrested. At the conclusion of the conference, a tribute to Comrade Stalin was called for. Of course, everyone stood up, just as everyone had leaped to his feet during the conference at every mention of his name. The small hall echoed with, quote, stormy applause rising to an ovation, end quote. For 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, the stormy applause rising to an ovation continued. But palms were getting sore, and raised arms were already aching, and the older people were panting from exhaustion. It was becoming insufferably silly, even to those who really adored Stalin. However, who would dare be the first to stop? The secretary of the district party committee could have done it. He was standing on the platform, and it was he who had just called for the ovation. But he was a newcomer. He had taken the place of a man who'd been arrested. He was afraid. After all, NKVD men were standing in the hall applauding and watching to see who quit first. And in that obscure small hall, unknown to the leader, the applause went on. 6, 7, 8 minutes. They were done for. Their goose was cooked. They couldn't stop now till they collapsed with heart attacks. At the rear of the hall, which was crowded, they could of course cheat a bit, clap less frequently, less vigorously, not so eagerly. But up there with the Presidium where everyone could see them, the director of the local paper factory, an independent and strong-minded man, stood with the Presidium. Aware of all the falsity and all the impossibility of the situation, he still kept on applauding. 9 minutes, 10, In anguish he watched the secretary of the district party committee, but the latter dared not stop. Insanity. To the last man, with make-believe enthusiasm on their faces, looking at each other with faint hope, the district leaders were just going to go on and on applauding till they fell where they stood, till they were carried out of the hall on stretchers, and even then those who were left would not falter. Then, after 11 minutes, the director of the paper factory assumed a businesslike expression and sat down in his seat. And oh, a miracle took place! Where had the universal, uninhibited, indescribable enthusiasm gone? To a man, everyone else stopped dead and sat down. They had been saved. The squirrel had been smart enough to jump off his revolving wheel. That, however, was how they discovered who the independent people were. And that was how they went about eliminating them. That same night, the factory director was arrested. They easily pasted 10 years on him on the pretext of something quite different. But after he had signed Form 206, the final document of the interrogation, his interrogator reminded him, "Don't ever be the first to stop applauding." I love that story in the same way that I like stories that creep me out. And you know, like what's weird about it is that it's a true story. What's weird about it to me is I think about it now. I've read this book for the first time, I don't know, a decade ago or something. And whenever I see something in the culture that seems to be getting universal applause, and then the applause just dies, I think of that story. And I wonder, I don't know, obviously, I don't claim to know very much about any of these things. But I wonder how much is sort of ginned up. So I'm going to read another excerpt here. This one's more philosophical. At this point in the book, Solzhenitsyn pretty much starts out with his arrest, so he's been arrested. He's been falsely accused. He's been tortured. He's been shuffled around. He's become acquainted with the Gulag Archipelago to some extent. In this excerpt, he's asking about the nature of evil, and this is one of the things that makes me really admire him, not just as a writer, but as a thinker, because he's introspective. He's not just pointing the finger at other people. He is examining his own role in his fate and his own role in the fate of the Soviet Union. And in a sense, he's asking, how could a regime kill 60 million of its own people? How could anybody be that evil? So here's what he says. Just how are we to understand that? As the act of an evildoer? What sort of behavior is it? Do such people really exist? We would prefer to say that such people cannot exist, that there aren't any. It is permissible to portray evildoers in a story for children of the past. Shakespeare, Schiller, Dickens. Inflates images of evildoers of the blackest shades. It seems somewhat farcical and clumsy to our contemporary perception. The trouble lies in the way these classic evildoers are pictured. They recognize themselves as evildoers and know their souls are black. And they reason, I cannot live unless I do evil. So I'll set my father against my brother. I'll drink the victim's sufferings until I'm drunk with them. Iago very precisely identifies his purposes and his motives as being black and born of hate. But that's not the way it is. No. To do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he's doing is good, or else that it's a well-considered act in conformity with natural law. Fortunately, it's in the nature of the human being to seek a justification for his actions. Macbeth's self-justifications were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Yes, even Iago was a little lamb, too. The imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses, because they had no ideology. Ideology, that is what gives evildoing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad in his own and others' eyes, so that he won't hear reproaches and curses, but will receive praise and honors. That was how the agents of the Inquisition fortified their wills, by invoking Christianity. The conquerors of foreign lands by extolling the grandeur of their motherland, the colonizers by civilization, the Nazis by race, and the Jacobins, early and late, by equality, brotherhood, and the happiness of future generations. Thanks to ideology, the 20th century was fated to experience evildoing on a scale calculated in the millions. This cannot be denied, nor passed over, nor suppressed. How then do we dare insist that evildoers do not exist? And who was it that destroyed these millions? Without evildoers, there would have been no Archipelago. Physics is aware of phenomena which occur only at threshold magnitudes, which do not exist at all until a certain threshold, encoded by and known to nature, has been crossed. You can cool oxygen to 100 degrees below 0 centigrade and exert as much pressure as you want. It does not yield, but remains a gas. But as soon as minus 183 degrees is reached, it liquefies and begins to flow. Evidently, evildoing also has a threshold magnitude. Yes, a human being hesitates and bobs back and forth between good and evil all his life. He slips, falls back, clambers up, repents, things begin to darken again. But just so long as the threshold of evildoing is not crossed, the possibility of returning remains, and he himself is still within reach of our hope. But when, through the density of evil actions, the result either of their own extreme degree or of the absoluteness of his power, he suddenly crosses that threshold, he has left humanity behind, and without, perhaps, the possibility of return. All right, so evil gets much of its power from ideology and from our agreement to do evil in the name of good. So he asks, as he's in this section, the next excerpt I'm going to read, he's on a rail car being transferred with some other prisoners. They've put the political prisoners through mix-up or through in some kind of nefarious intent, where they've put them with thieves instead of political prisoners. He doesn't ascribe anything bad to the he doesn't describe that as ascribe intention to them. It's just he's on a rail car and he's musing about how we respond to evil, in essence. So what I like about this excerpt is the literary quality to it and the profound thing that he's saying, while using the loss of all of his possessions as a kind of metaphor. So the train that he's on and the situation that he's in, he's going to turn into a metaphor that I think is relevant for everybody, wherever you're at. But it is better still to stop as soon as possible being a sucker. That ridiculous greenhorn, that prey, that victim. You will never return to your former world. And the sooner you get used to being without your near and dear ones, the sooner they get used to being without you, the better it will be, and the easier. And keep as few things as possible so that you don't have to fear for them. Don't take a suitcase for the convoy guard to crush at the door of the car when there are 25 people in a compartment. What else could he figure out to do with it? And don't wear new boots. And don't wear fashionable Oxfords, and don't wear a woolen suit. These things are going to be stolen, taken away, swept aside, or switched, either in the Stolypin car, or in the Black Maria, or in the transit prison. Give them up without a struggle, because otherwise the humiliation will poison your heart. They will take them away from you in a fight, and trying to hold on to your property will only leave you with a bloodied mouth. All those brazen snouts, those jeering manners, those two-legged dregs are repulsive to you, but by owning things and trembling about their fate, aren't you forfeiting the rare opportunity of observing and understanding? And do you think that the freebooters, the pirates, the great privateers, painted in such lively colors by Kipling and Gumilyev, were not simply these same blatnia, these same thieves? That's just what they were. Fascinating and romantic literary portraits. Why are they so repulsive to you here? Understand them, too. To them, prison is their native home. No matter how fondly the government treats them, no matter how it softens their punishments, no matter how it amnesties them, their inner destiny brings them back again and again. Was not the first word in the legislation of the archipelago for them? In our country, the right to own private property was at one time just as effectively banished out in freedom, too. And then those who had banished it began to enjoy possessing things. So why should it be tolerated in prison? You were too slow about it. You didn't eat up your fat bacon. You didn't share your sugar and tobacco with your friends. And so now the thieves empty your bindle in court to correct your moral error. Having given you their pitiful worn-out boots in exchange for your fashionable ones, Their soiled coveralls in return for your sweater. They won't keep these things for long. Your boots were merely something to lose and win back 5 times at cards. And they'll hawk your sweater the very next day for a liter of vodka and a round of salami. They too will have nothing left of them in 1 day's time, just like you. This is the principle of the second law of thermodynamics. All differences tend to level out, to disappear. Own nothing, possess nothing. Buddha and Christ taught us this, and the Stoics and the Cynics. Greedy though we are, why can't we seem to grasp that simple teaching? Can't we understand that with property we destroy our soul? Own only what you can always carry with you. No languages, no countries, no people. Let your memory be your travel bag. Use your memory. Use your memory. It is those bitter seeds alone which might sprout and grow some day. Look around you. There are people around you. Maybe you will remember them, one of them, all your life, and later eat your heart out because you didn't make use of the opportunity to ask him questions. And the less you talk, the more you'll hear. Thin strands of human lives stretch from island to island of the archipelago. They intertwine, touch one another for one night only in just such a clickety-clacking, half-dark car as this, and then separate once and for all. Put your ear to their quiet humming and the steady clickety-clack beneath the car. After all, it is the spinning wheel of life that is clicking and clacking away there. Okay, I'm going to read probably one more excerpt, since this is taking a little longer than I thought. This is an excerpt about one of Solzhenitsyn's temporary cellmates, and I think it's remarkable because it explores, in a sense, the naivete that this young man demonstrated, believing that the Soviet Union was going to be this, paradise. And so he's recounting the story as he understands it from his cellmate. No one would have believed the story of Erik Arvid Anderson had it not been for his unshorn locks, a miracle unique in all Gulag, and that foreign bearing of his, and his fluent English, German, and Swedish speech. According to him, he was the son of a rich Swede, not merely a millionaire, but a billionaire. Well, let's assume he embellished a little. On his mother's side, he was a nephew of the British General Robertson, who commanded the British zone in occupied Germany. A Swedish subject, he had served as a volunteer in the British Army and had actually landed in Normandy, and after the war he had become a Swedish career officer. However, the investigation of social systems remained one of his principal interests. His thirst for socialism was stronger than his attachment to his father's capital. He looked upon Soviet socialism with feelings of profound sympathy, and he had even had the chance to become convinced of its flourishing state with his own eyes when he had come to Moscow as a member of a Swedish military delegation. They had been given banquets and taken to country homes, and there they had encountered no obstacles at all to establishing contact with ordinary Soviet citizens, with pretty actresses who for some reason never had to rush off to work, and who willingly spent time with them, even tete-a-tete. And thus convinced once and for all of the triumph of our social system, Erik, on his return to the West, wrote articles in the press defending and praising Soviet socialism. And this proved to be his undoing. In those very years, in 1947 and 1948, they were roping in from all sorts of nooks and crannies progressive young Westerners prepared to renounce the West publicly, and it appeared that if they could only have collected another dozen or so, the West would shudder and collapse. Erik's newspaper articles caused him to be regarded as suitable for this category. At the time, he was serving in West Berlin, and he had left his wife in Sweden. And out of pardonable male weakness, he used to visit an unmarried German girl in East Berlin, and it was there that he was bound and gagged one night. And is not this the significance of the proverb which says, he went to see his cousin and he ended up in prison? This had probably been going on for a long time, and he wasn't the first. They took him to Moscow, where Gromyko, who had once dined at his father's home in Stockholm and who knew the son also, not only returned the hospitality but proposed to the young man that he renounce publicly both capitalism and his own father. And in return he was promised full and complete capitalist maintenance to the end of his days here in our country. But to Gromyko's surprise, although Erik would not have suffered any material loss, he became indignant and uttered some very insulting words. Since they didn't believe in his strength of mind, they locked him up in a dacha outside Moscow, fed him like a prince in a fairy tale. Sometimes they used awful methods of repression on him. They refused to accept his orders for the following day's menu, and instead of the spring chicken he ordered, they simply brought him a steak. Just like that. Surrounded him with the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and waited a year for him to be re-educated. To their surprise, it didn't happen. At that point, they quartered him with a former lieutenant general who had already served 2 years in the Norilsk. Norilsk? Sorry for my pronunciation. They probably calculated that by relating the horrors of camp, the lieutenant general would persuade Eric to surrender. But either he carried out that assignment badly, or else he didn't want to carry it out. After 10 months of their being imprisoned together, the only thing he had taught Eric was broken Russian, and he had bolstered Eric's growing repugnance for the blue caps, meaning the interrogators. In the summer of 1950, they once more summoned Eric to Vyshinsky, and he once more refused. In so doing, he made existence contingent on consciousness, thereby violating all the Marxist-Leninist rules. And then Abukumov himself read Eric the decree, 20 years in prison. For what? They themselves already regretted having gotten mixed up with this ignoramus, but at the same time they couldn't release him and let him go back to the West. And so they transported him in a separate compartment, and it was there that he had heard the story of the Moscow girl through the partition and seen through the train window in the dawn light the rotting straw-thatched roofs of the age-old Russia of Ryazan. Those 2 years had very strongly confirmed him in his loyalty to the West. He believed blindly in the West. He did not want to recognize its weaknesses. He considered Western armies unbeatable and Western political leaders faultless. He refused to believe us when we told him that during the period of his imprisonment, Stalin had begun a blockade of Berlin and had gotten away with it perfectly well. Eric's milky neck and creamy cheeks blushed with indignation whenever we ridiculed Churchill or Roosevelt. And he was also certain that the West would not countenance his, Eric's, imprisonment. That on the basis of information from the Kubyshev transit prison, the Western intelligence services would immediately learn that Eric had not drowned in the Spree River, but had been imprisoned in the Soviet Union, and either he would be ransomed or someone would be exchanged for him. This faith of his in the individual importance of his own fate, among other prisoners' fates, was reminiscent of our own well-intentioned, orthodox Soviet communists. Notwithstanding our heated arguments, he invited my friend and me to Stockholm whenever we could come. "Everyone knows us there," he said with a tired smile. "My father virtually maintains the Swedish king's whole court." For the time being, however, the son of the billionaire had nothing to dry himself with, and I presented him with an extra tattered towel as a gift, and soon they took him away on a prisoner transport. All right, so hopefully that was, you got a little taste of the Gulag Archipelago from that reading. I want to mention that the Good Books list, if you haven't downloaded it, there's no reason not to. It's completely free. We did choose a winner for our February book bundle giveaway, which was $100 of new books from Amazon from the list, and that actually went to Melissa Hoffman of New York. She won the New Beginnings bundle. We're doing another one in March. So this is not, we're not selling anything with this. It's free. You download the Good Books Guide and you click share on Facebook or Pinterest and you'll basically get a ticket to win. And then at the end of the month we will do a drawing for the new bundle, the Friendship Bundle. I have a copy of the books here. The first book was chosen by Rachel Kraimpotek. I've not read this one. It's called The Chosen. Rachel loves that book. I have read this one. This is it's not a first edition of Winnie the Pooh, but it's a replica first edition of Winnie the Pooh, hardcover. Love those books. Fantastic books. Caddy's World by Hilary McKay. And 84 Charing Cross Road, if you've never read the series of letters between a writer and a bookstore owner in Britain. So an American and a British citizen. It's well worth reading. It's really, really charming. This is one of my favorite authors, Connie Willis, science fiction author, does a lot of time travel stories. This one's called Blackout. We have another literary masterpiece, Frog and Toad Are Friends. Yes, they are. And along that same line, Bink and Golly. I have not read Bink and Golly, nor have I read Peanut Butter Friends in a Chop Suey World, but this is on my list of books I want to read. We also have Amber Brown is Not a Crayon. And this book, which has won it was a Prince Honor book and the Excellence in Young Adult Nonfiction, so YALSA winner. It's called Vincent and Theo, young adult book. We have a hardcover edition here with the original stickers on it. And then last but not least, we have it's a paperback version, but using the original, the first edition illustrations, a version of The Jungle Books by Rudyard Kipling. So there you have it. There's the friendship bundle that we're giving away in March, and the Good Books list. You should be able to find it on the Clearwater Press page, or we'll put it in the comments. Hope you guys enjoyed the Gulag Archipelago, and I highly recommend it. And thanks for joining me. Have a good night.